think that there are good reasons why people wanted to come back. And the reason is that they feel alienated from the school. They don't feel like the school is a part of them and that they're a part of the school in ways that obtained 100 years ago.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions.
So, John, I have a question. As an historian, how did you become interested in studying the one-room schoolhouse?
Well, I became interested in it because I realized that the more I read, the more that my understanding of what, especially 19th century education was a very urban-centered one, that I thought of education as something that happened in 2- and 3-story buildings. And of course it did. But in the 19th century, the United States is still a rural place. It's not really until 1920 that a majority of Americans live in a community that has 5,000 people. So I had a skewed vision of what the educational past was, and it was that realization that led me to think more about rural America and one-room schools.
Well, John, thank you so much. We're so glad that you did decide to do the research because it has been fascinating to us, and I think our audience has asked some wonderful questions and also have shared some terrific insights from their own personal lives, from their family histories about the one-room schoolhouse. We certainly want to hear some more, so at this point we'll turn it back to John Zimmerman for more of the Little Red Schoolhouse. Here he is.
So if the Little Red Schoolhouse wasn't red, and if it was often this very threadbare building, why do we remember it as this beautiful, bright red, often pristine, very well-appointed structure? The answer has to do with, after the Civil War, as the country urbanized and industrialized, the rise of something I call the sentiment industry. That is, poems and paintings and songs that influence collectively the way all of us remember this institution. I think the most important single work that changed how we remember it is Winslow Homer's painting, Snap of the Whip, which Homer produced in the 1870s. And I found a review of the painting in a Boston newspaper, 1872, which I think really embodies this process I'm describing of collective memory. The review says, "Every person from the countryside knows the powerful associations lingering around the old red schoolhouse. No spot in the whole world is so full of histories and memories." Well, that's right. It is full of histories and memories, but the point is that Winslow Homer had a big role in creating those memories, right? The people reading this actually hadn't been to a red schoolhouse because most of their schoolhouses weren't red. But here you have the reviewer saying, well, when I look back on this, I can't forget the red schoolhouse of my youth. And so people remember it as red. And poems had the same effect. One of the poems that kids often memorize was by John Greenleaf Whittier. It's called In School Days. And this is what kids all over the United States recited. "Still sits the schoolhouse by the road, a ragged beggar sunning. Around it still the sumacs grow, and blackberry vines are running." So in the poem, the poet, that is Whittier, he enters this now kind of barren, former one-room schoolhouse, and he remembers the girl that he loved, who apologized for passing him in the spelling bee. And she says to him in the poem, "I'm sorry that I spelt the word, I hate to go above you, because," the brown eyes lower fell, "because you see, I love you." And other takeoffs had boys missing the word on purpose to let the girl pass, and most of all, boys goofing off and getting punished. This is from Missouri. "Still sits the schoolhouse by the road, close by the old oak tree, where many a boy has taken a dose of grim old hickory tea." And hickory, of course, is the hickory stick. And what's going on there? This, too, is an interesting maneuver in memory. It's a celebration of the bad boy. The bad boy's good. Oh, yeah. The bad boy is good. Bad is good, right? In this urbanizing era, the bad boy represents this kind of liberty and vitality, a masculine liberty and vitality of a long-lost rural America that we're afraid we've lost. And you see this in Tom Sawyer, right? At the end of Tom Sawyer, he lowers a cat onto the schoolmaster's head, and the cat pulls off the master's wig. But of course, most teachers weren't masters. They weren't men, they were women. But in Twain, when you remember your own youth, you remember a teacher like the bad boy is male. Basically, the only way you can assert this kind of rustic masculinity is to win a schoolhouse battle with a guy, right? It won't do to defeat a woman. So you have painting, you have poetry, and then with electricity, you have commercial entertainment, music, theater, and film. The song School Days, 1909, this song here, School Days, dear old golden rule days, reading, writing, arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick. You were my queen in calico, I was your bashful barefoot beau, and you wrote on my slate, I love you, Joe, when we were a couple of kids. So here it's a couple looking back on this. But you know who wrote this? Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards was an immigrant who came from Germany at age 7 to Brooklyn. He had never been in a one-room school and most likely never went to one later. By the way, he's later a booking agent for other young talent, for Groucho Marx and Eddie Cantor. But this urban guy, this Brooklyn guy, he writes our best-known paean to the one-room school. In 1949, the New York Times ranked School Days as one of the 10 most popular tunes of the century. So one of the ways we remember the institution like we do is because of all these other images that came after the institution that color, quite literally, the way that we remember it. So what happened to the school itself? Why did one-room schools start to go away? The answer begins with the progressive movement of the early 20th century. We associate that with the presidents. That would be Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And at the city level, we associate it with social reforms that tried to clean up cities for boards of health and new forms of transportation and voting reform, et cetera. But there was a countryside progressivism too, and it was targeted at the one-room school. The one-room school was called inefficient. It was called dirty. So there were state laws passed about the size that the school had to be, requiring outhouses, and most of all, state laws either encouraging or requiring consolidation. That is, combining different one-room schools into larger ones. And the progressives used statistics. That was their favorite mode of argument. So in the classic progressive cartoon about schools, you would have a rural kid and he'd be describing his school and he'd say it only goes 7 months of the year and the teacher has lousy pay, the teacher has very little experience, there's no library. But then you look at the other side, you look at the urban side and look at that well-dressed young cosmopolite. And look at the school behind him, which is not just a school, it's a temple, right? Look at those pillars. And of course, his term is longer, the teacher makes more, he's got a library. So they would use this kind of argument, and they would also use historical pageants. And you see a good example in this a cover of a school journal. You can see that the girl is looking back fondly at the one-room schoolhouse, but everybody who looks at this image well understands that her school, the consolidated school that you can see behind her, is superior. So the progressives wrote articles with titles like "The Little Red Schoolhouse is a Fake," and they take aim at the sentiment industry. Because if they're going to persuade Americans to consolidate their schools, they're going to have to wean them off these romantic images. And they tried. They had a good deal of success because many schools were consolidated, but not in the Midwest. And into the New Deal, into the 1930s, you can see a similar kind of dynamic. You can see reformers taking aim at the one-room school, but a new sentiment industry growing up to celebrate them as a kind of fount of American greatness. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal played a big hand in consolidating schools. The Works Progress Administration paid for school construction and refurbishing. It was also a big part of Franklin Roosevelt's political campaigns. If you look at his one of his leaflets when he ran against Alf Landon in 1936, you have a couple guys talking about schools in Kansas, and Landon had been the governor of Kansas. You see the Kansas schools, There's a one-room school. It's very decrepit. One farmer says, "Where's Alf today?" And the other says, "Oh, he's back east telling the folks about education." But at the same time, we've got New Deal reformers attacking these institutions. During the same era, there's going to be a new sentiment industry around them. This is the time of Little House in the Big Woods. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who herself had grown up in the Dakotas, had been a teacher, both a student and a teacher in one-room schools. These became bestsellers during the same era, during the 1930s. This was also the era that the Amish became a focus of American tourism. Here we are in a part of the world where many tourists come to see Amish people and look at their style of life. That also dates from the 1930s. And one of my great historical ironies is the Works Progress Administration, which spent millions of dollars getting rid of one-room schools, also published a poster celebrating them. A WPA poster called Pennsylvania, the Little Red Schoolhouse, where you see Amish kids and families going to one-room schools. During the Second World War and the Cold War, the Little Red Schoolhouse would play a slightly different role. It would become a symbol of democracy. Remember, in the Second World War, we fought a fascist enemy. And so you may have seen pictures of the German generals surrendering to the Allies after Hitler killed himself. Well, that happened at a 3-story technical college in Rheims, France. It's about a half block long. But when it was reported in the American press, the Germans surrendered to the Allies in a one-room schoolhouse. This is what the Cleveland Plain Dealer reported. How typical of our democracy that the final surrender of Germany should take place in a red brick schoolhouse. For the Little Red Schoolhouse has played a most important part in the growth of this democracy that we cherish. The victory over Germany is one more victory for the Little Red Schoolhouse. And again, it was red, but it wasn't little. It was a technical college, right? After the First World War, Second World War, of course, into the Cold War, the United States is challenged by a different totalitarian enemy. That would be communism. And it shouldn't surprise you that the Little Red Schoolhouse entered into anti-communist literature. E.M. Root published a famous pamphlet called How Red is the Little Red Schoolhouse? And you see a kind of simian-like Soviet guy injecting this red communist propaganda into the one-room schoolhouse. This was also a time when American corporations, including the manufacturers of toys and games, began to capitalize literally and figuratively on the one-room schoolhouse. Parker Brothers introduced a game in the 50s called, yes, the Little Red Schoolhouse. It featured a schoolmarm and a bell. It was a quiz show game at a time when, of course, quiz shows were coming into television. So that was during the Second World War and during the Cold War. When you get into the 1960s and the 1970s, a time of tremendous cultural and social debate, especially over education, you find that the Little Red Schoolhouse remains a symbol, but it's invoked by both sides. So people on the left, if you will, liberals or radicals, they invoke the Little Red Schoolhouse on behalf of mixed-age classrooms, on behalf of group learning, and most of all, on behalf of the open school, the school without walls. It turns out in the 1960s, 20% of schools that were erected in the state of California had no interior walls. And when I went and researched them, I found Little Red Schoolhouse imagery and names all over them. The Big Red Schoolhouse, the Big Schoolhouse, trying to recapitulate the communal and the age mixing aspects of the one-room schoolhouse. However, on the right, the Little Red Schoolhouse is also invoked, but it's invoked as a symbol of order at a time when lots of Americans feel that disorder and lack of discipline is infecting young people. It becomes invoked as a symbol of faith at a time when a lot of Americans object to the fact that courts have said that teachers can't lead prayers in schools. It also became a symbol of the Back to Basics movement in the 1980s. It was linked to